Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining North Carolina Humanities this evening for North Carolina Reads, Soul City. We'll give everyone just a moment to join us, and then we'll get started with introductions in the program. If you'd like to throw in the chat where you're joining us from this evening, we would love to hear from you. All right, looks like we've got some folks joining from Raleigh and Wilmington. Welcome everybody from Hillsborough. Keep all those cities coming. We'd love to hear where you're from as folks join. I see Greenville, Winston-Salem, Greensboro. Welcome everyone. Lexington, Durham, Salisbury, Warren County, Spencer, Oak Island, Franklin. All right, keep all that coming. We'd love to hear where you're from as we get started this evening. Okay. So, hello, everyone. I am Melissa Giblin, Director of North Carolina Center for the Book at North Carolina Humanities. It is my pleasure to be speaking to you this evening from Charlotte, North Carolina. Welcome to this evening's virtual book event. And joining me from our staff is Caitlin Stanley, who will be assisting. Thank you for joining us at the first virtual event in a series for North Carolina Reads, our statewide book club for 2022. North Carolina Reads features 5 books that explore issues of racial, social, and gender equality in the history and culture of North Carolina. As a statewide nonprofit and affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, our mission is to connect North Carolinians with cultural experiences that spur dialogue, deepen human connections, and inspire community. This evening features a moderated panel discussion on Soul City, race, equality, and the lost dream of an American utopia, the first book in our North Carolina Reads series. Please note, any views, findings, conclusions, opinions, or recommendations expressed by our partners and participants do not necessarily represent those of North Carolina Humanities or the National Endowment for the Humanities. It is our pleasure to welcome Adrienne Meirday, Associate Director of the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission, as this evening's moderator. Adrienne Meirday has served as the Associate Director of the NC African American Heritage Commission since 2020, where her role focuses on grant project management and communications. Prior to her time with the Commission, she spent over 8 years working in museums and cultural institutions in North Carolina. She has always had a primary interest in sharing diverse stories, particularly those that have not yet been told, and centering the communities that hold them. We would also like to welcome Thomas Healy, author of Soul City, and Dr. Kofi Boone, North Carolina State University Professor of Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning. Before we turn the event over, we will briefly discuss a few housekeeping points for this evening's event and how to engage with us. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available after the live session. We'd love to hear from you during today's event. If you have a question, please send it through the Q&A or the chat tab. We encourage you to share your experience on social media by tagging @NCHumanities. And closed captioning is available for this event. Please click the CC button at the bottom of your screen. It is my pleasure to turn the event over to Adrienne to introduce our panelists.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Melissa. And thank you to North Carolina Humanities for hosting this wonderful event. I know I'm very excited to be involved and excited to get this conversation started with our panelists. So I will start off by reading their biographies. Thomas Healy is a professor at Seton Hall University School of Law, where he teaches and writes in the fields of constitutional law, freedom of speech, legal history, civil rights, and federal courts. He is the author of Soul City, which was selected as the New York Times Book Review's editor's book of choice and named one of the books of the year by Library Journal. A native of North Carolina, he began his career as a journalist, working first at the News Observer in Raleigh and later as Supreme Court correspondent for the Baltimore Sun. We are also joined this evening by Kofi Boone, who is a professor at North Carolina State University, and his work focuses on design and planning strategies that address environmental justice and social equity through the landscape. In addition to research, teaching, and community engagement, Kofi serves on the boards of many organizations, including president of the Landscape Architecture Foundation. Good evening, Kofi and Thomas. I hope you're both doing well.
Good evening. Thank you. You're doing great.
Good evening, Adrian. Yes, doing great. Thank you.
Fantastic. So to start us off for the evening, we have a few questions that we'd like to go through. And I think first off, I'd really like to ask Thomas, what led you to the topic of Soul City? What inspired this work?
Thanks. It's a great question. As I say in the prologue of the book, I didn't know about Soul City for the first 21 years or so of my life, even though I grew up in North Carolina. I grew up in Charlotte, not that far down I-85 from where Soul City was planned and developed. I first learned about it when I was a young reporter at the News and Observer in Raleigh in 1991, when Floyd McKissick, the founder of Soul City, passed away. And one of my editors just sort of mentioned as an aside, McKissick's effort to build what my editor referred to as an all-Black city, an hour north of Durham. And, it was such a compelling idea when I heard about it, and it seemed so ambitious and audacious, the idea of trying to build a city from scratch in the late 1960s and early 1970s, that it sort of always stuck with me. Even as I went on, left daily journalism and became a law professor, it was something that was always sort of in the back of my mind that I wanted to research and learn more about. And then in 2014, I started thinking more seriously about it. And that was right around the time of the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson and the protests that developed there. And, it occurred to me that the source of the unrest in Ferguson was very similar to what had led Floyd McKissick to want to build Soul City. And that was a desire for independence and autonomy and self-determination, because as we all know, in Ferguson, the population was about 2/3 African American, and yet all of the levers of power was controlled by whites. And that was the situation that faced residents of Warren County in North Carolina in 1969 when Floyd McKissick announced his plans. 2/3 of the population was African American, and yet all of the local boards were controlled by whites. There was one recently hired Black police officer in Warren County. And McKissick's idea was that in order to really achieve political equality and political independence, you had to have economic equality and economic independence. And so, he wanted to build a place where Black people would have that kind of control over, over their political life and over their economic life. And it was really, I think, seeing the parallels between Ferguson and what McKissick was trying to accomplish, and realizing that even though 50 years had gone by, not much progress had been made, that, essentially the people who were protesting in Ferguson were demanding the same sorts of things that McKissick was demanding in 1969. That struck me as a really powerful parallel. And it also made me want to find out why Soul City did not succeed. And I thought that maybe if we could figure out why Soul City didn't succeed, what the forces were standing in its way, that it might tell us a little bit more about why we haven't achieved economic and racial justice today, and maybe what some of the obstacles are that we need to deal with.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Thomas. And I think, that's not a, you started into it because it was something that you didn't know very much about. And I think across North Carolina, we see a lot of folks are not familiar with this story of Soul City. And it's one of those things of like, this did not happen very long ago. This is still within the lifetime of very many folks who are still with us. So it's really important that this story gets raised up. And with that, I wanted to ask both of you, what was the most surprising thing that you learned about Soul City?
Kofi, I'll let you go first.
Oh, okay, sure. Well, I came into the Soul City story sort of after, because even when I was in Michigan, I'm a Detroit native, I learned a lot about the environmental justice movement in college and learned about the Warren County PCB protests in 1982 in Warren County. So, when I finally relocated to North Carolina, those breadcrumbs of studying about the roots of the PCB protests connected to, in fact, some of the same people who were part of Soul City. So I actually stumbled on Soul City through an environmental justice lens. But, one thing that was surprising in some ways, there were a few layers. The first one is I knew about the Rouse Corporation. We learned about that in urban planning and, their work in many places. Woodlands, Texas, which is referenced in the book. And our professional landscape architecture is important because it's a precedent from Ian McHarg, who was really a pioneer of environmental analysis in our profession. And he used those techniques applied to Woodland. So we knew about Woodland, knew about Rouse Corporation, didn't know that they were also connected to the Soul City story as well. And, when you look at the differences over time, which Thomas covers very well in his book in terms of who got, $50 million, didn't, it started to reveal some of those disparities. But politically, I'd heard of Jesse Helms, when I was in Michigan and, a lot of that work, but had no idea that he more or less made his bones fighting Soul City, and that, one of his adversaries was Harvey Gantt, who, the great architect and urban planner, and also, mayor of Charlotte, who, really, were at opposing sides of this whole situation. So the fact that it was, connected to subsequent movements of resistance was a surprise to me. The fact that these, as has been stated, this mainstream story of the Rouse Corporation, how development happens, excludes often what happened in Soul City, was a surprise. And of course, the politics of, the idea that certain personalities that really shape national politics were directly for and against what happened in Soul City.
I would say that I think that the politics is interesting, and it's a really important part of the book, but not super surprising. That to me, in some ways, Jesse Helms's opposition is you sort of just expect it. I think I did find the opposition that came from some liberal circles pretty surprising, in particular the News and Observer, which at the time I think was viewed as liberal on issues of race. It was led by Claude Sitton, who was this legendary civil rights reporter for the New York Times, viewed as a hero really by many civil rights activists. He was the editor of the News and Observer, which was the paper that really led the attacks on Soul City on the editorial pages and on the news pages, running a series of investigative articles that alleged all sorts of fraud and corruption and nepotism and conflicts of interest, which either turned out not to be true, or if they were true, they were perfectly legal, and yet they were made out to seem nefarious and as though McKissick was somehow fleecing the government. And a year-long congressional audit proved that those charges were unfounded. So I think that, to me, that was surprising to see the News and Observer really allied with Jesse Helms on this topic. And, I think some veterans of the News and Observer really bristle when you suggest that the News and Observer was an ally of Jesse Helms. They say, well, how could that be? Jesse Helms, the News and Observer and Jesse Helms hated each other. Well, they may well have hated each other, but they pretty much worked in lockstep to bring Soul City down and to thwart what McKissick was trying to do. To me, one of the really surprising things as I researched the story was how close McKissick actually came to pulling this off. Soul City has been so thoroughly forgotten, and there was such an attempt to discredit it by people like Helms and to make it seem as though nothing at all actually happened here, right? As though McKissick was just, up in Warren County in a trailer, cashing checks from the federal government and not doing anything with it. But he actually, he got pretty far, and he got pretty close to realizing his dream. He ended up purchasing about 3,500 acres of land. This was all, unimproved, undeveloped land that he had to clear He laid electrical lines. He got money for a 3-county regional water system, for a sewerage system. He built a factory. He built the first neighborhood at Soul City, a pool and rec center, a volunteer fire department. And there was a lot of infrastructure that was created in a really short period of time.
Yeah, the medical center too. That was significant.
Absolutely, the health clinic. And he didn't really get serious money from the federal government until about 1974, and he was shut down 5 years later. So almost all of this was done in a 5-year time frame, which is pretty remarkable. HUD consulted with a British planner who said that the amount of development at Soul City, in that short period of time was as much as any British new town had accomplished. So that to me is surprising. And the final thing I'll say is that I was also surprised how many allies McKissick was able to win to his side. When he first announced plans to build Soul City in Warren County, locals were really skeptical that this would ever happen, and they were really wary about Soul City, in part because they recognized what that would mean for their control over the county, if a predominantly Black community of 50,000 people was built in their midst. But McKissick, he worked hard to win these people over and to show them how Soul City could benefit the entire county. And Warren County, then as now, was a economically depressed part of the state. And local politicians and local business leaders, they all got on board. The Warren County Board of Commissioners passed a resolution supporting Soul City and offering whatever help it could. As I mentioned, the nearby counties, Vance and Granville counties, joined together to help build this regional water system. And McKissick said at one point, sometimes to help yourself, you have to help others. And I think that he proved that he could build alliances with local people, both Black and white, who saw how Soul City could help the whole region. And yet you still had people like Jesse Helms and the News and Observer doing everything they could to block this from happening.
Absolutely. Thank you both for that response. I appreciate the feedback regarding, the closeness to pull it off. That's, in some ways, there are portions of this book where it almost reads like a novel of all the different happenings and all the things. And then it's like remembering, no, this is real. This is real documented history. This, the responses that certain politicians had, as well as newspapers had, this is very documented. And I think that I also was surprised about the response that one of you, Thomas, you interviewed one of the newspaper, the editor after he retired, and kind of got him to admit to a certain extent that, yes, it is possible to have a story that has a lot of false components to it, but that's not what happened with Soul City. So it's kind of an interesting viewpoint there.
I mean, I think there's a lot of institutions that, that I think come in for criticism in the book. I think the bureaucracy of HUD was certainly a problem. There was all the politics in North Carolina. Industry was very risk averse and very worried about associating with a community that was going to be predominantly Black and that was going to be called Soul City. But I also think that the story here really serves as an indictment of a particular kind of journalism that is, that is very narrowly focused on just trying to, find what's wrong with a development like this, and purports to sort of portray it objectively and honestly, but by leaving out, at least half of the story about what Soul City was responding to and all of the good things that Soul City was doing for the area. It's not an objective picture at all. It's really, at most half a picture, and really, only the half that serves to discredit Soul City. I found that really frustrating, to be honest, as a former newspaper reporter. I know how the imperative of a story takes over. And once you as a reporter and once you as a newspaper commit to a narrative like this, you have to keep going with it, and you see that. I mean, even when the congressional audit comes out and it largely exonerates McKissick. I mean, as the I think it was maybe it was the Carolina Times, one of the local Black newspapers, they ran a banner headline, GAO, exonerate Soul City. The News and Observer portrays it exactly the opposite. They just look for anything in the GAO report and in the audit that supports their narrative and make it sound as though this vindicates them. And it clearly didn't vindicate them. But by this point, they're so invested in this story that they have to keep going with it, even though they had basically been proven wrong.
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing. It's not minor. It's a serious point, but it's, connected. Yeah, I appreciated the reference to the Black press in the book as well, that there wasn't just one narrative, but it illustrates how power works in terms of which narratives become, dominant, quote unquote, master narratives, which ones become counter, and, how that plays out. But I did appreciate the inclusion of Carolina Times and other references moving through the book. It's important that there wasn't just a single story. It's just one story had a little more power because of the way the world was then.
Absolutely. And, it's not a surprise that the News and Observer adopted a particular narrative, because there was practically no diversity in the newsroom at the News and Observer at the time. I mean, I tried to find out whether there were any Black reporters, and I couldn't get an answer. But I don't think there were, to be honest. No one could name a Black reporter or editor at the News and Observer in 1975 when these articles were published, and that makes a difference. I mean, when you have people with different perspectives and different backgrounds in a newsroom, you're going to approach your coverage of different communities in a different way. And I think had there been Black reporters and Black editors who could have scrutinized what the News and Observer was reporting more closely, you might have had very different coverage. And it shouldn't take having diversity, right, for these stories not to have been written the way they were. I think that would have helped prevent that.
Absolutely. Thank you both. I wonder, a little bit of a transition here. Why is it important to interpret the Soul City project within the broader historical context of both the Federal New Communities Act as well as the Civil Rights Movement?
I mean, I would say that Soul City was often cast as this sort of far-fetched, fanciful idea. But the reality is that this was just one of 13 new communities that Congress was supporting and HUD was overseeing under the New Communities Act. And, this idea of building a new city from scratch, it may seem, rather strange to us now, but at the time, it was a pretty mainstream concept in planning circles. There was this deep concern about what was happening in urban centers in the United States and what was going to happen as the population continued to grow. And one of the responses to this that many people accepted was to create new growth centers. And that's really what Soul City was a part of. And I think that putting it in that context helps to push back against claims that this was some, Black separatist project. I mean, it wasn't a Black separatist project. It was being supported by HUD, of all places. There's legally, HUD could not have supported a community that was going to be racially segregated. And they made clear from the beginning that they wouldn't do that. And that was never the intention behind the project. And yet many people described it that way and as a kind of step away from integration. And it wasn't that at all. I mean, it was going to be integration with a different look and a different feel. Instead of being 80% white and 20% minority. It was going to be the opposite, but it was still going to be a multicultural community. And so I just think it's important to realize that this is just, this is part of a kind of mainstream planning effort in the late 1960s and 1970s.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there've been for centuries, since enslavement. What do you do? In Reconstruction, there's an incredible history of Black towns, Black institutions. People pulling together and building things. Immediately thinking of people like Booker T. Washington, and who intentionally thought about Tuskegee University and Tuskegee Institute as a place to train people, not just in the intellectual exercise, but the exercise of actually building community physically. That students in those early generations actually built that campus. And you could see where they went. Like when they had that experience, they took that experience with them and it went to new communities and new districts and they kind of disseminated it that way. And, I thought about Soul City in that way, which is, Thomas referenced, the murder of Mike Brown for sure in Ferguson. But, at the time that I had, the privilege to read this and write a review, we were in the throes of, the murder of George Floyd, and there were many, groups of people, trying to figure out, am I safe in a particular community? Can we start again? Is there a way to kind of begin with sort of justice and equity at the root? And, really that perception, it's a time capsule, but it's still present in terms of, if Black people, African-Americans and others are in leadership, right, are setting economic priorities, political priorities, and in the case of Harvey Gantt, design and planning priorities, automatically it's interpreted as being separate and not for other people, when in fact that's not the case, not in the case of McKissick for sure. So there's still like growing pains from that period of time where the perception of who's in control starts to impact how everyone else reacts, particularly conservative white people. But I think that it's still a valuable lesson. It's still something that's important for people to understand because the underlying passion and impetus that drove it that way, moving from, say, civil rights and dealing with political action and legal structure to actual physical communities, is something that's just as current as it was then.
Absolutely. And I think it also situated North Carolina in the context of, highlighting how much of the civil rights movement occurred in North Carolina. And I think, generally we know about the Greensboro sit-ins and things, but I don't think that a lot of people are familiar with the extent and for how long the movement continued in our state, particularly when you go towards Warren County and those efforts, that's really significant. So in terms of, in the pursuit of creating Soul City, what were the side effects of the process to create McKissick's vision for a utopian city?
I mean, I think one of the side effects is that he did a lot of good in Warren County during the time that he was trying to develop Soul City. There would be stories in the newspapers about how much money he was getting from the federal government in the form of various grants. All of that money was going toward the local population, the healthcare clinic and feeding programs and, Head Start programs. I mean, this was money that he was bringing in to the state from the federal government to make life better for the people who lived in Warren County. And life was hard for a lot of people who lived in Warren County, and not just African Americans, but a lot of white people who lived in Warren County. Life was hard. The healthcare clinic in particular, that continued to operate for decades after Soul City was shut down. It was finally closed around 2010, and it served hundreds of thousands of people in that area, people who otherwise would not have had decent healthcare. They put in the first public pool in the county. There would have been no place for people who couldn't afford to belong to a private club to go swimming. They, as I said, they built this neighborhood where people could live. They did have an industry that was, or an industrial building that was occupied for a number of years, providing jobs to the area. So he brought a lot to that region of the state. The regional water system, still provides water to that 3-county area. Was a huge, important piece of infrastructure that still benefits the people there today. And then I think just more broadly, the attempt to build Soul City really placed the focus on economic empowerment, which, as I said, McKissick believed was the key to political independence and political freedom. And that was really, McKissick's primary emphasis coming out of the 1960s. He had been all along an integrationist, and he had been a part of the movement for Freedom Now. But as much as any civil rights leader, and probably more than almost any other one, he had really emphasized the importance of economic development, and had seen that the important litigation and legislative victories of the 1960s, that they just weren't translating into real economic gains. And I think Soul City, the attempt to build Soul City, it really helped to put the focus on those kinds of issues and to emphasize, Black entrepreneurialism and what came to be called Black capitalism. Although I think, that makes it sound a little more maybe conservative and laissez-faire and a little less radical and socialist than it probably was. But McKissick believed strongly that you have to put capital in the hands of Black people, and that they have to be able to accrue wealth through the same mechanism that that white people had accrued wealth through.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. I mean, I think my first official visit to Soul City was about a year and a half, 2 years ago. So being able to ride the streets, and this is going to sound really mundane, but the streets were well designed and they were still in good shape. And he referenced the pool; it was still there, and the park associated with it was still there. And the downside, I would say, the flip side of such sturdy infrastructure was the conversion of one of the Soltech facilities into a prison facility for incarcerated people to work, which is really a tragedy. It's almost one of those right in your face juxtapositions of the complete flip, of the dream, so to speak. But it does speak to it was well planned, it was well built, it was built to last. It wasn't just a flash in the pan. And something that gets lost sometimes is I didn't get the impression that he had taken on anything like this before, or that his team had. So, first of all, the ability to pivot and to learn and to translate, the coalition building and the advocacy and the activist work that he clearly was an expert in, to the world of building, and convincing investors and convincing others to follow along in the dream and the build, is a rare talent. But it also kind of highlights, even the Rouse Corporation has failed. They've done things that with all of their expertise didn't work out, but they were able to rebound and bounce back, right? They they could afford to learn from that failure and move on. And how tragic it is in some cases, as people are learning and building their skill sets for things completely out of their control, they're not allowed to try again and to build again. But I think that the more the story gets out, there are other generations that are interested in the same sorts of things that can gain the good lessons from it.
Absolutely. And thank you for calling that out, Kofi. I think that's such an important thing. It's like this example of like coalition building across all of these different spheres, from the investors to politicians to, getting the right urban planners on board. It's really remarkable that like such an incredible team was able to be like brought together, for what they were able to achieve, especially at that time period, is really, it's really significant. So the book, and we've talked about this some, it details several factors that led to Soul City not being realized. What might have enabled Soul City to ultimately succeed as McKissick had envisioned?
It's a great question. And there were obviously a lot of challenges. Some of them were inherent to the project. I mean, attempting to build a city of 50,000, out of nothing but the red dirt of Warren County was going to be an uphill battle, regardless of the surrounding circumstances, because you had to attract industry at the same time that you attract residents, and you had to build an infrastructure for both industry and residents to come in and to use. So it was going to be inherently challenging. And then you throw in the opposition from Jesse Helms in the News and Observer, and you throw in the fact that we went through not one, but two economic downturns in the 1970s, a combination of really high interest rates and inflation and low growth, stagflation, which is just about the worst possible environment for large scale real estate development. There were lots of challenges, but I think had the federal government fully committed to Soul City, that could have made a difference. Congress passed the New Communities Act in 1968, allocated $250 million. 2 years later, it reauthorized the act, added some more details, and allocated up to $500 million. That money was divided between 13 towns. Soul City was on the low end in terms of how much money it received. It was initially offered a $14 million loan guarantee, but they only ended up getting $10 million of that $14 million over about a 5-year period. And almost as soon as Congress passed the law, it began to back away from that commitment, and really sort of left HUD with very little guidance about how to run this program, what these towns should look like. And HUD, therefore, created all of these hoops for towns like Soul City to jump through. And I think it was clear to everybody that the federal government was really only partially committed to building these towns. And think about it, if you're General Motors and you're considering building a plant in Soul City, as General Motors was seriously considering, and you don't have any kind of assurance that the federal government is in it for the long haul, you're not going to make that investment. There was a moment when the CEO of General Motors asked HUD for that assurance, and HUD said, "We can't give it to you. We can't tell you that that we're going to be in there for the long haul." And so I think had the federal government really fully committed, and I think that also would have helped to defend against some of the criticism. I think with the federal government not fully committed, Helms knew it was just a matter of time. He could just keep battering away at Soul City until HUD just gave up. And that's really what happened. And Kofi, I thought you put it really nicely in your review of the book, when you talked about, this is a part of an emergent neoliberal pattern of providing just enough funding so that projects like this fail, and then pointing to the failure
Right.
as an argument that, look, these kinds of programs are doomed to fail from the outset. I really liked that insight of yours.
I appreciate it. My students hate it when I talk about neoliberalism, so I'm glad there's somebody who appreciates that term and that word. Yeah, I do think that was at play for sure, as people were divesting from the Great Society, and it was just a sea change in terms of how we thought about change strategies as a nation. And this project's kind of caught in the middle. In some ways, it reminds me in a way of this is a segue. I'm from Detroit, and we're very protective of who tells our story. So most people who write about Detroit, we don't like very much. We don't like their books. But there's one that's really good by Thomas Suguru called Origins of the Urban Crisis, in which he talks about when Detroit came out of World War II, because it was converted into the arsenal of democracy. It actually had some of the most advanced infrastructure in the country, if not the world. And the people that eventually wanted to invest in the Jet Propulsion Lab and wanted to invest in Silicon Valley were like, yo, you have the best infrastructure in the whole country. We should just move there. And the labor organizers, Walter Reuther on down, were like, nah, we're good with building cars. And a lot of people track that very pivotal decision of not thinking about conversion to a new way of developing the city with the with what we have faced today. And, you know, as an outsider and from a distance, investing in manufacturing in rural North Carolina at that particular time was dependent on so many contingencies that were out of people's control. You know, at the same period of time, that's when, you know, Chapel Hill and Raleigh and Durham are like, hey, we need this research triangle park, because all three communities, you know, we celebrate them and talk about them being stable and great, you know, sort of ed med centers now, but at that time, no. So they were redefining their work, and they were dealing with like technology and, you know, that kind of thing. And so, you know, I think that Soul City, and Thomas lays it out very well in terms of the very specific things to what's happening, you know, with that particular community in that particular county. But in the broader vision of regional growth and trends and speculation, there were some decisions made that I think just made it hard moving forward. And you wonder now, like we're in this age now, we're all on Zoom now, where, you know, there's disassociation, so to speak, from where you work with what you do. You can work remotely, you can do all. Ironically, places like Warren County and other places should be first in line for people who are looking for, you know, that connection to the land, that connection to, you know, smaller scale communities, still connected with digital technology. But in some ways, Soul City was too far ahead of its time.
Absolutely. Places like Asheville, North Carolina, where people are flocking to in this time where it's, you know, they can still have their job in New York or wherever and live in a really beautiful place. That's regular life in North Carolina for a lot of people now.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds like you're rubbing it in, Adrienne.
I am, but I'm not. I have family who are in Asheville who are not pleased with all the new folks moving in, but that's all right. You know, we relocated to North Carolina as well, so you know we might be part of the problem. So, absolutely. So I wonder, as we get towards the end of our conversation here, what can we learn about Soul City regarding how we view our role in creating a more just and inclusive society?
You saved the hard question for last.
No,
you know,
can we solve all of our problems?
Yeah, you know, I think the difficulty in writing about something like Soul City that didn't succeed is that a lot of the lessons are discouraging lessons and dispiriting lessons. I mean, you know, one of the big takeaways of the book is just, you know, how many institutional and systemic obstacles there were that Soul City faced, you know, from industry and politics and the media. And I think, you know, I think it's a really good illustration of, you know, how our society is organized and structured so as to make it difficult to achieve things that will improve the lives of African Americans. And you know, I think that's a lesson of the book. It's not necessarily, you know, an encouraging lesson, and it's not a kind of you know, guide to what we can do to change that. I will say that one of the things that jumps out at me is when you think about the opposition to Soul City, it really comes from two different places. It comes from the Jesse Helmses of the world, who were never likely to support Soul City because of racism and a host of other reasons. And then there are the liberals at the News and Observer, who should have been natural allies for Soul City, but who couldn't get beyond their own ideas about what equality and integration should look like. You know, so Claude Sitton was interviewed many decades later for an oral history project and asked about Soul City, and without prompting, he said, you know, he described it as all Black and said, I couldn't go in for that. I was an integrationist, you know, and that just shows you that he wasn't listening to what McKissick was saying. You know, McKissick said over and over again, this was not going to be a separatist community. This was going to be an integrated community, but that integration could take different shapes and different forms. And he was also, you know, making a point about what he thought Black people needed in order to achieve economic equality. And Claude Sitton just wasn't listening. Claude Sitton had lots of virtues, but he was a super stubborn person who saw things in really just black and white terms. And he couldn't get beyond his own prejudices, not racial prejudices, I don't think, but just prejudices about how the world should look and what racial equality and racial justice could look like. And to me, that's a really powerful lesson. I think, as a white person who, views himself as, sympathetic to the cause of racial justice and someone who wants to be an ally to people fighting for racial justice, that's, I think, an important lesson, to have some humility about, my own wisdom and what I think might be the right path forward, and to listen more closely to what African Americans are saying about what they need to achieve equality, and what other people of color and other groups that have been historically persecuted and disadvantaged are saying.
Yes, that's all great. I agree with that. I mean, I think of a few things that, are lessons that, and I agree with it, Thomas, the tone of it, because it was never fully actualized, kind of leaves a bad taste in the mouth. However, I still hold on to the power of coalition building and building community. In some cases, it's physical, it's built environment, but it starts with relationships between people. And I think there's still a lot to learn about that, that for people who may have that impetus, that drive, that passion, even though they don't have the personal experience, it may not be the large top-down, policy-driven federal government initiative, but there are many communities around the state and around the country where small groups of people have formed, all kinds of relationships and leverage their networks to affect change in their communities. And so I think it's heartening to know that someone could go into that arena without, the quote unquote technical expertise and work it out. I mean, it didn't hit the finish line, but huge strides were made. And I think that leaves some steps there. The second part of it is, of course, how I was introduced to it, which was in reverse, with the environmental justice movement. And so, a decade and a half later, that's when, the Warren County PCB landfill protests occur, which also they failed as well, meaning they weren't able to prevent the landfill from being built. However, that movement is credited with the mainstream environmental justice movement, where there were scholars and researchers and others there that were present that started to use that situation as impetus for, toxic waste and race in 1987, Clinton executive order, Office of Environmental Justice. And, today, in a broad sense, with the Biden administration, with the Justice 40 executive order, challenging all of the federal agencies to reinvest 40% of renewable energy infrastructure in disadvantaged communities. You could see it kind of coming back around, which is to say, from a sort of a sustainability born from the environmental justice movement, a reinvestment in place that prioritizes the jobs component of which McKissick was hinging so much of Soul City on, that it is starting to still have an impact on how we think about reinvestment in place. And so there are definitely a lot of specific failures, the cumulative effect of not actually having that physical community intact and all together. But I think they're components that people can take with them because that move for justice doesn't end.
Absolutely. And I think, conversations like this, conversations looking back to Soul City, raises up that there are still so many lessons that we can learn from it, and that, we can still be hopeful. We can still be hopeful about, the stepping stones and the progress that is being made. There was a quote that Kofi quoted Danielle Purifoy, I believe, who was the creator of the Soul City documentary, the most recent version, and talking about how we wanted freedom to be a place. What an important dream to have. What a vision to seek.
Yeah, I mean, that was a pleasure. I mean, Danielle moderated a session I was in with Floyd McKissick Jr. really reflecting on the legacy of Soul City. It's interesting, the same event, we were talking about the legacy of Princeville, North Carolina, which is the topic of a whole nother conversation. The first town founded by free African Americans in the country, not, just a couple hours away. But that idea that she brought it up, and it's interesting, her, Danielle, I believe her father, her uncle was actually a physician working at MedTech. So, there were even ties there. But yeah, I thought that was just a wonderful statement that still rings true today.
All right. We are getting towards the end of our time together, but I do recognize that we've had a number of questions in the chat as well as in the Q&A section. Humanities Council folks, would you mind directing and sending some of those questions our way?
Yeah, of course, Adrian. So the first question we have in here was from John, wanting to know more about Harvey Gantt's connection and if he'd worked with McKissick at one time, and just wanted to know more about that aspect of the project.
Sure. Yeah. Harvey Gantt did play a role in Soul City. He after graduating from Clemson, he had practiced architecture for a couple of years, and then he went to the graduate school in architecture at MIT and was interviewed by McKissick when he was finishing up there. And Gantt had, interviews and offers at lots of prestigious places, but he was really intrigued by McKissick's vision. And so when he graduated from MIT, he moved down to actually, I think he lived in Durham County but was working at Soul City, and was the, essentially the kind of head planner there for about a year and a half during the early development. He subsequently moved to Charlotte and became the mayor of Charlotte, but he did sort of work on Soul City on and off throughout the 1970s, and then obviously he ran against Jesse Helms in two bitterly contested Senate races. I guess that was 1990 and 1996. I think I'm getting those dates right. And that was one of the one of the sort of interesting ways in which the story sort of circled back around, because you get, Helms really doing everything he could to kill Soul City in the 1970s, and then he and Harvey Gantt face off against one another in 1990, and then again in 1996. And in fact, Helms ran ads against Gantt in 1990 that referenced Gantt's work at Soul City, and essentially accused Gantt of getting rich off of the government's funding of Soul City, which was patently absurd. I mean, his salary was not very much, and nobody got rich off of Soul City, and this was just of a piece with Helms's race baiting advertising. Helms also ran the famous White Hands ad, where there's a picture of white hands crumpling up a rejection letter, and the narrator talking about how Harvey Gantt wants people to get jobs on the basis of their race, and Jesse Helms doesn't think that's right. So this was all just Helms's race baiting approach to politics. But I interviewed Gantt for the book, and he had some really interesting things to say about his time at Soul City, and and about the dream that McKissick was trying to accomplish. And he reflected on both the audacity of it and the improbable nature of it, but also sort of what a compelling vision it was. And it was that vision that attracted people like Gantt. There were other talented people who joined the staff. Eva Clayton, who later went on to serve in Congress. Floyd McKissick Jr., who Kofi was on the panel with recently, who obviously was in the North Carolina Senate for a long time. Lou Myers, who I think is here. I saw him in the chat, who played a really important role at Soul City. Lots of really talented people, a lot of people from UNC, from the Department of City and Regional Planning, who participated in Soul City.
We do have a couple other questions. So our next one says, social media seems to enormously influence public opinion in our society these days. How did the News and Observer exercise a similar power back then? Did the public question their position?
This is, Kofi, I don't know about you, but I feel like this is such an interesting part of the story because the News and Observer held so much power at this time. I mean, the media landscape was pretty bare, right? There was, the
no internet. There weren't. Yeah, exactly. It's a lot of things are different from that for sure.
Yeah, I mean, there was there were quality newspapers in the various cities. The Greensboro Record and the Winston-Salem Journal and the Charlotte Observer and the News and Observer. But the News and Observer was clearly the most influential and powerful newspaper in the state at the time. And when it created a narrative like this, it really set the tone and told everyone else how to think about it. And so there wasn't that much pushback. There was from the Black press, as Kofi mentioned earlier. But the AP picked up these stories and they ran in the New York Times and in other major newspapers, and everybody just sort of accepted what the newspaper said, as gospel.
Yeah, I'm still struck by your writing and your reporting about how the main writers who perpetrated this at News and Observer had there's a lot of credibility from previous work and civil rights work elsewhere, and so I could see sort of there being this general acceptance, even though it was negative, saying, well, that person is an ally, they wouldn't lie or make stuff up, and so, but there was sort of this merging happening between different individuals and influence and power. So that it's just unfortunate. I think if the writer had not had that previous background of having some credibility of being seen as a reasonable reflector of legitimate civil rights advocacy, and I don't know, maybe there would have been a bit more pushback, or hey, you're just in bed with Jesse Helms, that kind of thing. But I think that ironically it was that perception of being a moderate, fair-minded, having done the due diligence that I think influenced people potentially, of saying, oh, wow, if this person is saying this, then it must be somewhat accurate. So it was a shame, though. And it's something that I highlighted when I was reading the book.
Thank you for those answers. We did have a quick follow-up too. It sounded like you guys were talking about sort of a general kind of consensus in some ways around these papers, but someone wanted to know the Raleigh Times, did they have the same stance on this? Were they involved in this process? This, kind of information war on the development as well?
So I'm trying to remember what I think it was the Raleigh News was the afternoon paper. I think I'm right, or maybe it was the Raleigh Times. I can't recall whether the afternoon paper's coverage was any different from the morning paper's coverage. And I'm also kind of forgetting now when those two papers merged to one. You would think I would know this since I work there, but I'm a little hazy on that at the moment. I mean, some of the other papers in the state were covering Soul City prior to this big series the NNO ran, and some of that coverage was positive. What really sort of turned the coverage was when the federal government gave McKissick this $14 million loan guarantee. Prior to that, there was a lot of skepticism that this would ever get off the ground. And once McKissick got that loan guarantee, the coverage was very positive for about a 2-year period. There was this big groundbreaking ceremony in the fall of 1973 the new governor, Jim Holshouser, came and gave this, really soaring Kennedy-esque speech at the groundbreaking, and the coverage of all of that was really pretty positive. There's lots of positive coverage in the Charlotte Observer and the Greensboro paper and the Winston-Salem paper, and then the Durham, I guess it was the Durham Morning Herald at the time. And then when the News and Observer comes out in March of 1975 with this series of critical articles, that's really when the coverage shifts, and there's really no dissenting from what the News and Observer has reported. I think everyone just sort of accepted that because it was in the News and Observer, it must be true.
Thank you for adding that to the response. We did have a couple questions that I'm kind of going to group together. I think for a lot of folks here tonight, this example highlights parallels from other areas, looking at Reconstruction or even modern projects that are, kind of in the same space of being really heavily critiqued or analyzed in the public, or having this big dream, this big aspiration, but being underfunded or under supported in some way by institutions. Did anything else in your research or in your experience, do you see those parallels? Did you have other moments where you thought, hey, we've seen this lesson before?
I think, we seem to keep cycling through this particular lesson, right? Where, there's a serious effort to, put the legacy of slavery behind us, or to remedy the legacy of slavery. And then there's a backlash to that. I mean, I think we see that with Reconstruction, and then the era of Jim Crow that develops after Reconstruction. I think we see that. I think the civil rights movement really sort of then leads us into the Reagan Republicanism. And I think arguably we saw that. Probably not arguably, probably we definitely saw that. After Obama's election, and then the 4 years after that administration ended, it seems as though whenever there's a concerted effort to really make progress, there's a nearly equally concerted effort to block that progress and to take us backward. I do believe, I think we all have to believe in, that the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice, and that, we're making progress, and there might be steps backward, but there are more steps forward. And I think that's right. But I think that history, should make us realize that it's not going to happen in a linear way, that, that there's going to be pushback, there's going to be resistance, because it's about power, and people don't like to give up power. Nobody likes to give up power or privilege. Nobody's going to do it. Not many people are going to do it without putting up some kind of resistance. And I think, you can see that in this story.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's a theory of change thing. I mean, I think that one thing by Reconstruction is that, it's coined 40 acres in a mule. No one ever got 40 acres in a mule. Land redistribution was a major component of the initial moves in Reconstruction that were, clearly overturned, in the days after. But this theory of change of saying that land ownership and who's through what means is still current. One of the boards I had a chance to serve on recently had a whole group of people in Freedom, Georgia, like in the aftermath of Ahmaud Arbery's murder, just decided as a group of Black families to purchase, the same thing, like undeveloped, land in rural Georgia, and build a town from scratch. But their theory of change was they couldn't rely on, the federal government. They couldn't rely on, these programs through HUD. They had to do it themselves, almost getting to the Black capitalist strategies that, for various reasons, McKissick started to champion around that time. So, there's still that impetus. It's still there, you know. But in terms of how and where, there's definitely been a shift to, you know, a priority on ownership, a priority on associating ownership with control, as opposed to relying on old policy and infrastructure to make that promise.
Thank you both for those reflections. I want to be mindful of our time here. So I think I'm going to just kind of take the sentiment of these last two questions and kind of we'll end on those. Both of them are kind of asking more about the broader kind of factors in North Carolina at the time. The location for this project, was that a factor that really, if there had been a different community, a different part of the state, perhaps, that would have impacted the outcome here? If you've been, you know, maybe farther away from some of these centers of power or in a different, you know, corner of the state. And then what was the role of the governor or other state agencies in this project?
You know, there were definitely people who criticized the location, and I can see that. You know, it was not very close to any, you know, existing large city. I mean, Raleigh and Durham were not particularly large at the time. I can't remember. I quote their population in the book. I can't remember. I think, I'm not sure if either of them was over 100,000 at the time. And you know, they're not that far from Soul City, but I think in 1969, you know, that 65-mile drive might have felt kind of far. And there was really, you know, no kind of economic base in Warren County that McKissick could build on. But, you know, it had a lot going for it as well. There was a lot of land to be had. It was cheap. There were a lot of people who needed jobs in that area. There were several highways, either adjacent or near the property. There was Carr Lake that they could rely on for a source of water and for recreation. There was a railroad that ran right by the property. And, you know, it was halfway in between Raleigh, Durham, and Richmond in that Piedmont industrial corridor. So, you know, I actually think that the location makes a lot of sense, made a lot of sense, and still makes a lot of sense. I still find it surprising that, you know, in that stretch between Raleigh, Durham, and Richmond, that there isn't a kind of more significant population center. You know, I think maybe had he tried to build it closer to Durham or even sort of as a part of Durham, but you have to remember part of what McKissick wanted was self-determination. And the closer you get to an existing city, the more what you're trying to do is going to be dictated by the powers that be in that city. And, you know, Durham was, you know, in the late 1960s controlled by whites, even though the population was, you know, probably close to half, you know, most of the power was held by white people even then. And so I, you know, yeah, I think we can look back and say, well, you know, maybe if you had built it closer to another city, but I think that would have undermined what McKissick was trying to do. And the New Communities Act itself, you know, the whole goal was to build new growth centers, not just to, you know, add on bedroom communities. And then I know we're kind of running out of time. I'll just say the governor was really supportive. Governor Holshouser, who was elected in 1972, was a big supporter of Soul City. A lot of state agencies contributed, you know, and I think that's, you know, another sort of strange thing about the story. You've got the federal government that wants to support it. You've got local government that wants to support it. You've got state government that wants to support it, but you've got Jesse Helms and the News and Observer doing everything they can to discredit it. And that's enough, you know, in this sort of, you know, economically fragile decade to kill the project.
Okay, and I'll hand it back over to Adrian as we work on our closeout. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Caitlin. And thank you, Thomas and Kofi, for this wonderful conversation. Thank you to the North Carolina Humanities Council for hosting. This was It's such a wonderful thing, especially these day and age, to have almost like, our virtual book club here, and to be able to sit down and to, hear from the horse's mouth from some experts in the field who are very knowledgeable about this history.
Yeah, thank you, Adrian. And before we conclude for the evening, I'd like to allow Kofi, Adrian, and Thomas, if they would like to share an upcoming project that you might be working on with our audience. So whoever would like to go first, if there's anything upcoming. Thomas, you have another book in the works, or Adrian, please tell us what the African American Heritage Commission is up to. We'd love to hear from you.
Adrian, you can go first.
All right. Well, I do have a link ready to paste in the chat here for folks. I recognize that we do have a lot of folks here who are interested in civil rights history, particularly here in North Carolina. And most every community in North Carolina has their own civil rights story, whether it's, a Soul City or, a sit-in movement or something in between. But I would like to invite you to take a look at our North Carolina Civil Rights Trail program. We currently have applications open, and our goal is to join communities in physically marking these sites across the state. Our goal is to have 50 sites marked by 2023. So feel free to take a look at our website. Feel free to reach out to us and let us know if you have any questions. But we would really love to talk to folks about marking this important history.
Thank you, Adrian. Thomas and Kofi, would you like to share anything that you're working on upcoming?
I got two things. I think, well, first of all, thanks for having us all together. Other work with the African American Heritage Commission in the state. We just spent last year looking at the Charlotte Hawkins Brown Museum and Palmer Memorial Institute in Sedalia, North Carolina, and we're trying to, in the same way, recover some of that history and use it as inspiration for reinvestment. So that's been really cool, working with the students. And in my other hat, in my other life, as president of Landscape Architecture Foundation, we are gearing up for our summit on April 9th at the National Building Museum in Washington, D.C., with the topic of the Green New Deal, grounding the Green New Deal. So build design and planning and policy strategies to help move forward on jobs, justice, and decarbonization. So happy to share that, and looking forward to having a really rousing situation here in D.C. in a few weeks.
And Thomas, do you have any upcoming projects you'd like to share?
So first, thanks for having me. This was a fantastic event, and thanks, Melissa, for putting it together, and Adrian for moderating, and Kofi for reviewing the book and offering your thoughts and reflections here. A book project is a long undertaking, so you have to be careful when you're setting off. And I'm considering a couple of ideas right now, but one idea that I'm quite interested in is the Highlander Folk School, which was a social justice and leadership training center in Eastern Tennessee that was started in the early 1930s and played a big role in the labor movement, and then became a really kind of focal point for training during the civil rights movement. People like Rosa Parks and John Lewis who went through there. And I'm interested in it because it was a real multiracial effort to bring together working people to organize for change, and it feels like we need to return to something like that. I don't know. There are certain books out there and certain narratives that I think try to divide people along racial lines. And Highlander Folk School was really trying to bring people together to work for social justice, bring people together of different races, and I think it would be really intriguing to return to that and think about what the vision was there and whether we can recapture that.
Well, thank you all for sharing what you all are currently working on. It sounds exciting. So a special thank you to Adrian for moderating, and to Thomas and Kofi, of course, for their conversation. After the conclusion of this event, those of you who registered with an email address will receive a brief survey to complete. We would greatly appreciate you completing this survey to hear your feedback on this program. Please visit our website at www.nchumanities.org to learn more about our other upcoming events in the North Carolina Read series, and to subscribe to our email newsletter. Stay up to date with all North Carolina humanities news and programs. So thank you again for attending. Thank you to the audience for their great questions. And thank you to our panelists and moderator. We hope you all have a good evening. Thanks.